This is Saturn Girl. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Comment below because I want to know what you think and it helps me out with the algorithm. But anyway, you may know that Saturn is a very dour planet. So as my name suggests, I'm kind of the queen of doom and gloom when it comes to astrological predictions. I've always been like this, but I'm also an avid student of history. So I'm particularly interested in these big transits and also what historical events seem to correlate with them. I'm particularly interested in 3 main transits over the next few years coming up. Number 1 is Uranus entering Gemini, beginning in 2025. Then Neptune and Uranus conjunct, also starting in 2025. And then Pluto entering Aquarius, which begins next year in 2024, even though we've already had a prelude. But this particular video is going to be about Uranus and Gemini, and we'll address those other 2 transits in separate videos. But Uranus will be in Gemini starting July 7th of 2025 and remain there until about August 3rd of 2032. He probably goes retrograde a couple times or whatever, but, you know, in general. So that means Uranus stays in a sign for about 7 years. And it's kind of a long transit. Well, what's Uranus mean? Uranus is the planet of what? Unpleasant surprises, upheavals, rebellions, catastrophes. We'll see Uranus transits often correlate with natural disasters, and sometimes man-made ones. Well, what about Gemini? Gemini is an air sign ruled by Mercury, so it has to do with communications. It's mutable, so it's changeable and adaptable. And it also has to do with knowledge, right? But Gemini is also the 7th house in the United States Sibley chart. This is the birth chart for the United States. It was cast by a man named Ebenezer Sibley. If you're interested in those specifics, I suggest you check out my video on financial crises in the United States because I go into that in there. I really recommend it. Anyway, so the 7th house is what? Partnerships. And when Mars is co-present, like it is here, it represents breakups, schisms, and quarrels between partners. People who are peers in a relationship. And we can see that manifest in many different ways, especially for a whole nation like the United States. So anyway, the reason why this transit makes me so nervous is because this is what's called the 3rd Uranus return of the United States. You see, Uranus was in Gemini during the American Revolution. So he entered Gemini, April 8th of 1775. The first battles of Lexington and Concord, which started the American Revolution, they began just 10 days later, on April 19th of 1775. And then Uranus left Gemini, April 28th of 1782. This was just around the time the British began to remove their troops from many areas in the colonies. And then the war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Now, the first Uranus, because this was Uranus in Gemini. This is the birth of the United States, right? The Sibley chart is the birth chart, with the birth date of July 4th, 1776, which some of you may know, and with the birth time of about 5:10 p.m. Again, if you're interested in the specifics, go watch my video on financial crises. We're just mentioning this here to situate us in time and space, because the first Uranus return was the American Civil War. So this started Uranus entering Gemini, March 13th of 1859. So just 10 days before this, the Great Slave Auction. This was the biggest sale in U.S. history of people ever. So the biggest slave sale, I think I can mention that because this is educational. And I'm not glorifying anything. In fact, this was disgusting. The largest single sale of people in U.S. history, over 400 people in one sale. I don't know. I can't even process this mentally. And remember that the Civil War was primarily fought because of slavery. People dispute that and say it was economics. But the economic system of the South was what? Slavery. So, yes, it was economics and it was slavery. So, well, anyway, the primary division was between what? People who supported slavery and people who didn't. So, a few months later, in October of 1859, the militant abolitionist leader John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry, an armory in Virginia. His goal was to ignite a slave rebellion that would eventually put an end to slavery. Of course, he was defeated by troops led by who? Robert E. Lee, who would later become famous as the lead general for the Confederacy. And then what happened? November of 1860, the following year, was when Abraham Lincoln was elected. And that's when the southern states began seceding and leaving the Union. On April 12th of 1861, the following year, this is when Confederate troops actually attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And this officially started the American Civil War, which has been labeled the bloodiest single conflict in American history, according to the National Geographic. And that designation is sort of what scares me, because we see the history of these events, right? Anyway, so the war officially ended, though, with the Treaty of Appomattox, which was April 13th of 1865. Uranus didn't leave Gemini, though, until June 27th of 1865. This was only a week after what? After Juneteenth, which was June 19th of 1865, where Union soldiers entered Galveston, Texas, and announced that slavery was no more, right? They didn't know. And this became a national holiday recently called Juneteenth to celebrate and commemorate this event. Well, what about the second Uranus return? The second Uranus return of the U.S. began on August 7th of 1941. For those of you who are also students of history, you might remember 1941, a day that will live in infamy. He was talking about December 7th. That's what FDR said. And that was the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was, again, just a few months. Just a few months after Uranus went into Gemini. And this would be the event that brought the United States into World War II. It's also pretty interesting to note that a week later, on August 14th, the U.S. and Britain would announce the Atlantic Charter, which was their joint post-war plan for the entire world. It outlined some very idealistic things that Hitler wouldn't have liked, right? Like freedom and self-determination of nations, freedom from want and fear, like economic equality. I think these are things the United States wouldn't like now, to be quite honest. And then, like we said, in December of that year was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which became the impetus to drag us into the war. Well, and the war officially ended in September of 1945, after the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Nagasaki and then again on Hiroshima. But Uranus remained in Gemini until August of 1948. Well, what was interesting about this date? The interesting thing here was just a few minutes after the Marshall Plan became official. What was the Marshall Plan? Well, George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, he was formerly a general. He suggested that it might be to the United States' advantage to economically rebuild Europe so it didn't fall to the Soviet Union at the time. So this became official, right as Uranus was leaving Gemini. So, I mean, Europe was totally tore up, right? It looks like it was the Marshall Plan then that really marked the end of this conflict as far as the US was concerned. And if you think about it, the Marshall Plan was sort of like a reconciliation for all of Europe. Now, the dark side of it is that it really sort of kept encouraging some fascistic behavior in some ways, but we won't go into that. Anyway, now we're arriving at the third Uranus return. So why am I worried about this? Well, what are the conditions right now that sort of correlate with the conditions of these other events that we talked about? Well, number one, political divisions get a lot worse, don't they? For the American Revolution, we could see the stark division between Tories and revolutionaries, right? Those who were still loyal to the British crown and those who wanted to fight it, right, and be free of it. And of course, that meant political violence was on the rise, right? There are all kinds of fun little examples. I mean, they're not fun, they're gross. But of people being tarred and feathered and having, hot liquid poured down their throats. I mean, awful violence. Supposed to be symbolic things, but I mean, they were really disgusting things. So, well, what about the Civil War? The primary division here was between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, wasn't it? Those who were against slavery and those who were for it. Well, again, lots of political violence. The Sumner affair. Those of you might remember there was a congressperson who was severely beaten by another pro-slavery congressperson just because the other one was an abolitionist. So you could see how much animosity there was, especially on the pro-slavery side. Well, anyway, World War II. The primary division here, well, there were a couple, but between fascists and anti-fascists, and between isolationists and anti-isolationists, right? You might be like, whoa, what about the fascists and anti-fascists? Where were they? We don't think of those people in the United States around World War II, do we? But Madison Square Garden had the biggest Nazi rally ever in the United States. They filled the place up. I mean, you can look up pictures. It was really, really disgusting. Very scary. So you see, that thing has always been present here in the United States. Well, there were those who still supported Germany, right? I mean, those were fascists. And then there were people who also just in general didn't want to be involved. And those were the isolationists. For example, like John Kennedy's dad, Joe Kennedy, was an isolationist. Anyway. Well, so what are the conditions that are very similar now? We have proliferating racism. We've got increasing transphobia and homophobia, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and violence against women. A lot of this is surrounding the abortion movement. We see the rise of Christian nationalism and a push for a theocracy. Political violence also is unfortunately on the rise. We've seen countless events, recently even. The targeting of marginalized communities, the propagation of lies, misinformation, and stoking fear. The economy may be improving by some metrics, but the average person doesn't see it, do they? They live paycheck to paycheck, with the cost of living constantly going up, along with interest rates from the Federal Reserve. Home ownership is near impossible for most people. You see, these are very similar conditions to what were in Germany in the 1930s. Anyone who was left in Germany by 1939 was basically screwed. The other interesting thing that we notice here is typically that the technology, the communications technology, or the communications modes or forms of the day tend to exacerbate the conflict. I got this from the famous astrologer Nick Dagan Best. I heard him mention this on the astrology podcast a while back. But it is interesting to notice this, because Gemini has to do with communications, doesn't it? And Uranus has to do with technology. So anyway, and Nick Dagan Best wrote a whole book about Uranus and Gemini if you're interested. It's really worth reading. So anyway, well, leading up to the American Revolution, it was about the newspapers, right? The newspapers were the primary way of disseminating information. They were also the primary way of stoking political animosity and divisions. There was a lot of fear and anger and fervor on both sides. And then during the Civil War, it was the telegraph that became a driving force. It was the telegraph, or by the telegraph rather, that important communications were sent. They allowed for quicker military adjustments, and news was disseminated a lot quicker. Well, and then, later, during World War II, radio and film, motion pictures, became sort of the cultural mainstays, right? FDR began doing his regular fireside chats, which were radio addresses. And they sort of helped create this common identity among Americans, at least for those who were listening to FDR, because there was a big cross-section that didn't like him. And you can see the same sort of thing coming up now, right? Anyway, you see, it was also at this time that Americans could first see real images of the war and of violence in theaters. My grandfather used to tell me stories of, having a nickel and going to the theater and taking the trolley and all sorts of things. Anyway, well, what's different now? Or what is the technology now that's fomenting all the conflict and animosity? It's social media primarily, isn't it? I mean, cable news for years was creating animosity and fear among political groups, especially the two main ones in the US, the Democrats and Republicans. Now, Twitter, also known as X now, X gonna give it to you. The only X I really recognize is Malcolm X. That's my favorite X. So Twitter/X has become a cesspool of hate. People share whatever nonsense conspiracy theories just sound good to them at the time. And it becomes an echo chamber for nonsense. I just watched this young man. He's a Gen Z person. I'm not going to call him a kid because that's mean. But he's basically the one who started the whole birds aren't real conspiracy. It's a satire. He's a satirist. He's calling attention to the craziness, right? But he was just on Fox News, in character, legitimately talking about this birds are fake conspiracy theory. Again, he's making fun of Fox News with this, but unironically, tons of commenters were saying like, oh my gosh, I never knew this. I didn't know. How are these baby birds robots watching me? Like, people were taking it seriously. This is one of the scary conditions that we find ourselves in, where a good cross-section of people find themselves mired in fantasy and then acting violently sometimes on that. Oh, how about Tucker Carlson? Now he's on X. And he was on Fox for years spouting all kinds of bullshit. The most unimportant, ridiculous nonsense you could imagine. But a lot of it very hateful. Now all of these foment a culture of hatred and bigotry, which has now entered the mainstream and become commonplace and is actually driving mainstream policy. There's hundreds and hundreds of laws being passed against trans people in order to make them more marginalized and probably to eventually make us illegal. And quite frankly, Facebook isn't far behind. I've gotten tons of hate on Facebook. At least YouTube has sort of followed through on a lot of their policy, But they've also given platform in the past to racists, transphobes, misogynists, and anti-Semites, spreading their lies to stir up violence. So my big concern right now is political violence. I'm a trans woman. And right now, we are the focus of everyone's ire and hatred. Gun sales went up dramatically during the pandemic. That's scary. Hate groups and bigoted creators have become more and more common and more bold. There's dudes like Nick Fuentes who openly say this stuff and have way more followers than they should. Well, what do we do about this? Generations before us saw difficult times too. Maybe even more so. I don't know. I wasn't there. But they had to keep living day to day. They didn't really have a choice in the matter. We have to take care of our kids, our families, our communities. We have to keep on putting food on the table and making money. We have to pay rent. People will be like, what do the stars say today, Frankie? I'm like, they say the rent's too high. That's what they say. Right? Now, this is a test for humanity. And for us, isn't it? Individually. How we respond when someone more vulnerable is being targeted? How do we do that? How do we respond? What do you do when you witness bullying or injustice? And I don't just mean kids bullying each other. I mean actual violence. Are you the kind of person that walks away or hides your head and pretends not to notice? Because you will be tested on this. Is any of this tolerable for you? Do you just not want to rock the boat? Because it's too uncomfortable. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from the Birmingham jail. And he said that what poses the biggest danger to the civil rights movement wasn't the Klan. It was the white moderate who cared more about stability than about injustice, who would rather not rock the boat than to see people advance, to see people treated equally and like humans. You have a chance here. I have a chance here. We all have a chance here to prove ourselves. How are we going to live our lives during these sorts of events? What motivates us? Will we be motivated by love or fear and hatred? We all have all these complicated things colliding within us all the time. I'm scared, and it makes me angry being scared. I also know that those sort of mind states, those brain states, don't lead to good decisions. They lead to impulsiveness. They lead to violence. And they lead to division. Now, we're not going to clean up divisions, easily or anytime soon. But we can choose what we're going to stand up for. Are you standing up for the destitute, the vulnerable, and the oppressed? Because that's what we're going to be admonished to do whenever opportunity offers. You see, astrology is about fate. And it's about destiny. We can't choose our fate, but we can choose what we're going to do with it. And that is destiny. Destiny, let me put it this way. Fate is what's probable. Destiny is what's possible. So show us what you're capable of. Constructively. Show us what someone motivated by love and inclusion can look like and what they can accomplish. Fulfill your destiny and show us what it looks like. I hope this was sort of interesting and useful. Once again, like and subscribe and comment and please share. This is important information. I'm not trying to scare anyone. It's just that I want us to be aware and I want us to be ready for whatever comes, because that's what Vedic Valence and astrology is for. It's about being ready for whatever comes and facing it with a greater sense of equanimity and detachment. Easier said than done. Once again, thank you for watching till the end. Like, subscribe, comment, share. I do awesome videos that you can check out after this one. And I also do the best readings ever. It's scientifically proven. There are studies done. So, all my information is below in the description. Just look at it. Anyway, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful whatever you're having.